Mistakis has just started on this new project, a new research project, and we created this little video to tell you a little bit about the project, or actually more to tell you about some of the underlying questions, the research questions and dilemmas underneath this project. And it's basically about relating these three things: private land conservation, biodiversity or the conservation of biodiversity, and getting to 17%. And some of you probably know what that means, but I'll explain that in just a second. We're getting to work with a lot of really great partners on this project. We're working with land trusts across Alberta, land trusts across Canada. I'm getting to work with Government of Alberta folks, and Alberta Environment and Parks actually provided a grant to help us with this work. Working with the Canadian Wildlife Service and the folks who have been working on the Pathway to Target 1 Conservation 2020 at the federal level. So let's start there as a kind of description of what it is that we're trying to get at with this project. So some of you may have heard of this, the 17% goal. Where this started was the Convention on Biological Diversity, or the Conference of the Parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity. They sat down, they created a strategic plan, and that strategic plan had 5 goals and 20 targets. It's an international set of targets, and it's signed on to by a number of countries. Canada has signed on to it. Every country sort of interprets those targets for their own circumstance, their own country. But the target that's probably got the most attention has been the 17% target. And this target is essentially to protect 17% of the terrestrial land base and inland waters and 10% of the marine areas for the protection of the biological diversity of the planet. So one of the things that comes up in this is really interesting is, what is the role of private land conservation? And there isn't a question of whether there's a role for private land conservation, there's a question of what would that role be. So when you go right back to the original wording of that Convention on Biological Diversity target, it's really interesting. What they said was, in order to get to that 17%, we're going to count protected areas, traditional protected areas. These are the things that we like I said, traditionally think of. It's national parks, ecological reserves, those kinds of protective mechanisms. But then it said there's this other thing that we can use as well when we do that calculation. The short or abbreviated term is OECMs, but it's other effective area-based conservation measures. And the distinction here is that protected areas are those protective designations that have a primary goal for protecting nature, protecting biodiversity. OECMs are, again, protective mechanisms, but they don't have a primary goal of protecting nature, protecting biodiversity. But because of their restrictions, because of the land use restrictions or the resource restrictions, they actually have the effect of protecting biological diversity. So it was a recognition that there is this whole suite of mechanisms that are out there that are doing this job that we should include when we're doing that calculation of the 17%. So one of the challenges is, like I said, trying to figure out private land conservation in this. And to give you an example of why that's a challenge, think of one of the most common tools that private land conservation organizations like land trusts and conservancies use: conservation easement. So conservation easements in Alberta, like most places, there's a set number of purposes that they can be used for. So biodiversity, environment, or scenic purposes, cultural protection, can be for agricultural protection. The reality is, for any given conservation easement, it's likely a combination of these, maybe a combination of a couple of them, maybe a combination of all of them. So when we look at conservation easements and we try and figure out what we would include in that 17% target, some of it is pretty straightforward. We'd say, well, the ones where the primary goal for biodiversity conservation protection is there, so that's a protected area. And let's say that with a footnote, because there's a big debate on whether or not private land conservation, even when it has that primary goal of biodiversity protection, would count as a protected area. So that's part of what we're trying to work on here, is inform that debate. But then, like I said, there's this other interesting area where what happens when you have the resulting effect of protecting biological diversity, but that wasn't the main reason. So it might have been an agricultural conservation easement, but the way the restrictions are laid out and the land base that is placed on it actually has the effect of protecting biodiversity. So in those cases, those are other effective area-based conservation measures, or OECMs. And then there's going to be lots of areas that are protected by conservation easement that have nothing to do with biological diversity. They're set up for a different reason, for scenic protection, or maybe it's set up for agricultural protection. So those wouldn't count at all because they're not focused on biological diversity. So the challenge here is, okay, conceptually we get that, but how do you assess that? How do you screen that? How do you account for that? And how do you account for that on an ongoing basis? So that's really what our project is zeroing in on, is trying to come up with information to inform that discussion, and inform that discussion at all levels, the regional level within Alberta, a provincial level, a national level, and even right up to the IUCN and the mechanisms that are being used to screen OECMs and being adopted by different countries. So one of the other challenges that shows up here when we're looking at private land conservation is the difference between the conservation intent and then the actual designation, the actual protective mechanism, and what that looks like on private land and public land. So to give you an illustration of that, consider that the land base has private land and has public land. And in both cases, there are areas that are biologically diverse. We have a number of protective mechanisms, protective designations that we can use in either of these cases. When we place those mechanisms on biodiverse areas, in private land or in public land, and conservation is the primary goal, then it's pretty straightforward, probably, what the calculation of those would be when we come to look at the 17% target. Same thing when we look at areas where it's biodiverse, it's on public land or private land. Conservation of biological diversity is happening, but that's a secondary goal. So looking at those categories that we have within the 17% calculation, protected areas, OECMs, or neither, those ones with the conservation goal as primary should be protected areas. And again, I'll note that there's a big discussion about whether or not private land with a primary goal for conservation constitutes a protected area. And then other areas where it's a secondary goal, those would count as OECMs. That's fairly straightforward conceptually. Where we're getting some gray areas, okay, what happens when you have a conservation goal, a primary conservation goal on private land, on public land, but there actually isn't a lot of biodiversity, not a significant level of biodiversity. And we have a bit of an imbalance here that in the case of the private land, so I used the example before of a conservation easement for agriculture, it's a significant protective device. It's on private land, but it's not intended to protect biodiversity. It's not in a biodiverse area. We tend to exclude that from any calculation. It's not the same when we're on public land. So when there's a primary conservation goal, but there's a limited level of biological diversity. So think, for example, of the rock and ice areas of some of our mountain national parks. In those cases, we count those as protected areas, but the private land we would not include. So one of the things that we're looking at is how we level the playing field there. And then there's going to be situations where there is no effective biological diversity conservation mechanism. There's a protective designation, there's an intent to protect something, but not to protect biological diversity. In those cases, those don't count towards that 17% calculation. And it's really important to remember that what this is talking about is not just identifying 17% of our land base that happens to be biologically diverse. It's about the protective designation, ensuring that there is robust, sustainable protection. So public land, private land, biodiverse or not biodiverse, if there's no protective designation, it doesn't count in the 17% calculation. So one of the other challenges that we're facing is the word effective. You see that right in the name, other effective area-based conservation measures. And there's a lot of use of that concept in screening what counts or what doesn't count in that 17% calculation. But one of the challenges that we're seeing is the relationship between that concept of effectiveness and conservation effectiveness versus just simply the protection level, the mechanism that's used. So what tends to be happening is if we were to look at the sort of spectrum of protection from zero protection or very limited protection to high levels of protection, we're sort of implicitly or often explicitly relating effectiveness to that. Higher levels of protection, more effective, lower levels of protection, less effective. But if we think about biodiversity, and put that on another axis and say same thing, rating that from zero or near zero biodiversity protection up to high biodiversity protection. And if we look at a combination of those, then our consideration of effectiveness has to be more integrated, more a blend of those two things. And so that's one of the other things that we're trying to get into the conversation through this project is how do we have a more effective consideration of the concept of effectiveness that integrates these things. And you can kind of think of it as like a grid here. So there's an integration between these two concepts that's different in each one of these cells. So in the top left, we'd have high biodiversity and zero protection or near zero, very limited protection. An example might be a ranch, an extensive ranch. It has large amounts of habitat, significant amounts of biological diversity, but there is no protective mechanism there. Moving over, high biodiversity, low protection. So maybe a grazing lease might be an example where there is restrictions on use. There is some management regime that's put in place that has the effect of protecting biological diversity, but that wasn't necessarily the intent. And moving over, high biodiversity, medium protection might be that same ranch, only now we've got a conservation easement on it that provides a significant level of protection. And then far to the right, kind of the gold standard, high biodiversity, high protection, something like an ecological reserve. So you could do the same thing in every one of these cells where you're identifying in each case the relationship between protection and biodiversity, and then providing examples of an actual instance on the landscape where there was a combination of protection and biodiversity that fit that. So the reason for doing this is to then say, okay, well, what here would then constitute a protected area, what constitutes an OECM, and what doesn't fit in either category. So, for example, the extensive ranch, high biodiversity, that's great, but there is no protective mechanism. It wouldn't count in that calculation. The grazing lease, it's not primarily about biodiversity protection, but it does have that effect, so maybe that's an OECM. The ranch with a conservation easement might be either. If the easement has as its primary goal biodiversity conservation, maybe it's a protected area. If it has as its secondary goal biodiversity conservation, maybe it's an OECM. And the ecological reserve has as its goal biodiversity protection, it's a protected area. So you could do the same thing for each one of these and give an assessment of should that be included? If it's included, is it a protected area? Is it an OECM? One of the things that this kind of consideration helps us do is not just figure out what should be included and what shouldn't be included, but it helps us understand the relationship between these two concepts. Because if you're to take out all of these examples, the point is the upper part of this graph represents our goal. The point of what we're trying to do is to maintain and enhance the biodiverse landscapes of the country. So it doesn't really matter the level of protection in that sense. The goal is to have high biodiversity. But as I said before, we also want to ensure that that persists, that that's sustainable in a robust way. And that's the protective mechanism, but that's the tactic. It's not so much the goal. And that's what's represented over to the right-hand side of this graph. So what we're really looking for is the places where there's this overlap, where the goal of biodiversity and the tactic of protection at a higher level overlaps and provides us both of those things. So this is what this project really boils down to when we're looking at private land conservation and the 17% target, is saying, okay, in the cases of private land conservation, what qualifies as a protected area and how do we know that? How do we screen that? How do we catalog that? How do we maintain data on that? How do we come to agreement on that? What constitutes an OECM in the context of private land conservation? There'll be other types of OECMs, but we're specifically focused on private land conservation. And then what's not eligible under either category? And it's not to say that those are not important areas. Again, I'll use my example of the conservation easement for agriculture. It's a really important mechanism, a really important goal. It's not a biodiversity conservation goal, so it wouldn't come under either one of these categories. So that's the basis of the work that we're doing. We're trying to get more information into this discussion and working with all of these partners across the country. We'll be doing this throughout 2018, and we'll be keeping you updated through regular descriptions in our newsletter, so stay tuned.